Blood-type murder case. By Saburo Koga. A year of agony. Professor Kinumiya's mysterious death was so uncanny that it still returns to me in dreams and leaves me writhing in terror. Less than a month later, Professor Kasagami, my revered teacher, whom I looked upon as a father, and his wife unexpectedly took their own lives. I passed beyond shock. It was as though my soul had left my body, and I could not even weep. When at last I pulled myself together and read the only note the professor had addressed to me, I felt plunged into the depths of despair. I was ready to follow the professor and his wife at once and take my leave of this world, but barely managed to restrain myself. At the time, both the police and the newspaper reporters pressed me mercilessly to release the note. Yet I remained faithful to the professor's final wishes, insisting to the end that it could not be made public until a year had passed. How gravely the world must have misunderstood me for it, but there was nothing else I could do. Thus passed a year of suffering that, for me, was painful, inconsolable, sorrowful, exasperating, and altogether beyond words. Now that the first anniversary of my mentor Professor Kasagami and his wife's deaths has arrived, I am at last permitted to publish his note openly. I cannot say how relieved I am to have lightened, if only in part, the burden I have carried in my heart for so long. Before presenting the professor's note, however, I shall begin, in proper order, with the mysterious death of Professor Kinuma. The mysterious death of Professor Kinuma. February 11th was Empire Day. It was bitterly cold. At 6 that morning the temperature had fallen to -5.3 degrees Celsius, unusually low for Tokyo. Having drunk too much the night before, with school closed for the holiday and the cold making a third excuse, I had pulled the quilt over my head and slept on, unaware that 9 o'clock had already passed.
Mr. Uzawa.
A voice suddenly called beside my pillow. I raised my head and saw my landlady staring fixedly at me, pale-faced and suspicious. Something was plainly amiss, and I sat bolt upright, forgetting the cold. "Do you need something?" Instead of answering, she held out the business card in her hand. The first thing that struck me was the title printed on it, Detective S. Police Station. What has happened? My heart gave a jolt, and I became embarrassingly flustered. I could remember nothing wrong I had done that would bring the police to my door, but perhaps I simply lacked nerve. In any case, I lost my composure disgracefully. The landlady gave me another searching look and said,
"I don't know what he wants, but he says he'd like to see you."
I hurriedly changed my clothes, ran a hand through my disheveled hair, and went downstairs. A neatly dressed young man, with the air of a modern city boy, stood below. He was the detective from S Station.
"Are you Mr. Ozawa? I'm afraid Professor Kinuma has died."
What? I nearly leaped out of my skin. It sounded like a dream. Late the previous night, I had escorted Professor Kinuma home and had not left until I saw him safely into bed. In another 2 months, I would be entering my 3rd year of medical school. Surely I could tell whether a man showed any dangerous symptoms. Professor Kinuma had been drunk, certainly, but there had been nothing alarming about his condition. He was already 52, yet he had enough vigor to outdo any of us and enjoyed magnificent health, without a single physical complaint. Seeing me start, the detective grinned.
"I understand you took him home last night."
"Yes."
"There are a few things we'd like to ask for reference. Would you mind coming down to the station?"
He wasn't murdered, was he? Illness seemed utterly impossible, and the thought had flashed across my mind. Before my brain had given any command, however, my mouth appeared to move of its own accord, and the words were out. The detective's sharp gaze was completely at odds with his fashionable appearance. He looked me over and said,
"We'll talk at leisure at the station. For now, please come with me."
I made what preparations I could and was taken to S Station in a daze. After waiting for some time, I was called into an interview room. A square-shouldered man with closely cropped hair, every inch a police officer, sat behind a shabby desk. He did not introduce himself, but during our conversation I realized that he was the chief of police.
I understand you escorted Professor Kanuma home last night.
The chief began with precisely the same words the detective had used earlier. Yes.
At what time?
A little after 10, I think. At that moment, I remembered the clock in the professor's bedroom. Yes, it was exactly 10:35 when I left the bedroom.
Then when did you leave the gathering?
It was about a 10-minute taxi ride, so we must have left at around 10:25.
What sort of gathering was it?
A social gathering for medical students who had attended M High School.
How many people were there?
14 or 15 students. There were two professors, Professor Kanuma and Professor Kasagami. There was also an associate professor and an assistant who had attended M High School, but other business kept them both away.
Did anything unusual happen at the gathering?
No, nothing in particular. I recalled that Professor Kanuma and Professor Kasagami had seemed, unlike their usual selves, vaguely to avoid speaking to one another. But it hardly seemed worth mentioning, so I said nothing about it.
Was Professor Kanuma in good spirits?
Yes.
Did he drink a great deal?
Yes, quite a lot.
How much? Enough to lose all awareness?
No, I don't think it was that bad. Even after we reached his house, he changed into his night clothes by himself and said, "Thank you. You may go home now," before going to bed.
Do you always escort the professor home?
No, not as a rule. But his house is near mine, so everyone told me to see him home.
Professor Kanuma and you were the first to leave, then?
No, Professor Kasagami left shortly before us.
Did someone escort him as well?
No, Professor Kasagami hardly drinks, and he was almost completely sober.
Would you describe, in as much detail as possible, everything that happened from the moment Professor Kanuma entered his house until he went to bed?
Certainly. When we got out of the taxi, the professor was very unsteady on his feet. I took him by the arm and led him inside the front entrance, where he dropped straight down and sat on the floor. The elderly housekeeper who came to meet us frowned and said, "Oh dear, I'm sorry to trouble you, but would you help us take the professor upstairs?"
Was the housekeeper the only person who came to the entrance?
No, the maid was there too. She knelt down and removed the professor's shoes.
The student attendant wasn't there, was he?
No, I was told that the student who usually stayed there had been given 2 or 3 days off to go home. That was why they asked for my help. I supported the professor at the head while the housekeeper and maid took his legs, and between us we practically dragged him to his Western-style bedroom.
Was the gas heater already lit in the bedroom?
No. When the housekeeper lit it, the professor said thickly, "You should have lit it earlier. It's freezing in here," and began to undress, staggering and flinging his arms and legs about as if he were dancing.
Then he changed into his nightclothes and went to bed?
Yes. I nodded, hesitated for a moment over whether to say more, and then decided that I should. As he reeled about, the professor pulled various things from his coat and trouser pockets and placed them on the desk beside him. But when his hand touched one particular object inside a pocket, his swaying stopped for an instant and his whole body tensed, as if with a shock. Keeping it hidden from us, he quickly took it out and pushed it beneath the pillow on the bed.
What was it?
A small automatic pistol.
The chief nodded as though commending me for concealing nothing. Had the professor carried such a thing before?
I don't know. Last night was the first time I ever saw it.
Did anything else unusual occur?
No, nothing else. As soon as he had changed, the professor crawled into bed. Then he told me to go home.
And you left at once?
Yes. I hesitated again. It was my first time inside the professor's bedroom, so I became a little curious and looked around. Only for a minute or two.
You merely looked?
There were some unusual foreign books and academic journals piled on the desk, and I touched those briefly.
Only the books?
Yes, I touched absolutely nothing else.
Then you left the room?
Yes. Meanwhile, the housekeeper and maid had gathered up the clothes the professor had cast off, and each was holding some of them. I went out first, followed by the housekeeper and the maid.
You left the gas heater burning?
Yes, that's right.
When you left, was the professor already asleep?
He seemed half asleep. He was mumbling something and turning his head from side to side against the pillow.
Did you notice any sign that he got up at once and locked the door?
No, I noticed nothing like that. Was the door locked? The chief did not answer my question.
The housekeeper turned out the light?
Yes, there was a switch on the inside wall near the door. She pressed it as she left.
Thank you. That makes matters much clearer. One more question. I am told that you asked the detective who came for you whether the professor had been murdered.
My heart lurched. I regretted having said anything so unnecessary. The chief, however, paid no attention to my discomfort and continued without pause.
Why did you say that? I don't imagine such a thought would have occurred to you without some reason.
The victor and the abject loser. When I heard that Professor Kinuma was dead, my suspicion that he might have been murdered had no profound basis. As I have already said, death from illness seemed impossible, while suicide on the professor's part seemed more impossible still. An accidental death did not occur to me at that moment, so I let slip the suggestion that he had been murdered. Yet it was not entirely without reason. First, Professor Kinuma had been carrying an automatic pistol. Second, during the last 2 or 3 months, he had seemed vaguely afraid of something. Professor Kinuma had the bold, open-hearted manner common among professors of surgery. He could hold his liquor, his lectures were brisk and incisive, and he had a vigor that belied his 52 years. Trifles did not trouble him. During the past 2 or 3 months, however, although the change had not been striking, he had seemed somehow dispirited. A slight noise would startle him. He made foolish mistakes during lectures, and operations he would ordinarily have performed eagerly, he deliberately yielded to younger associate professors. Each incident was small, but together they marked a departure from his usual behavior. Watching the chief's expression, I said, "There is no particular reason. The professor had seemed rather strange lately, and then there was the pistol he was carrying." That was the extent of my explanation. The chief nodded.
One more question. Do you know why Professor Kinuma remained unmarried all his life?
I started again. It seemed that he had reached the very matter I had secretly feared. Nevertheless, I answered at once. No, I do not. That answer was not a lie. In one sense I knew, certainly, but everything I knew came from rumor, embellished only by my own conjecture. It was far from anything I could claim to know as fact. According to the rumors, Professor Kinuma had suffered a disappointment in love when he was young, and the woman in question was now Professor Kasagami's wife. Kinuma and Kasagami came from neighboring villages. They sat side by side at the same prefectural middle school, contesting first and second place, entered the same high school, again competed for the highest marks, and then enrolled in the medical faculty of the Imperial University. There Kinuma eventually went into surgery and Kasagami into forensic medicine, but that division came only after graduation. Throughout their student years the rivalry continued. Viewed in one light, the two professors were profoundly unfortunate men, born as though solely to compete with one another. Their contest was not a battle in which they could take up arms and settle openly who was stronger. Instead, in silence they competed for the esteem of their hometown, academic marks, class rank, and social position. Corrupt ambition, jealousy, and suspicion inevitably entered into such a rivalry, and it must have caused them terrible anguish. If the rumors were accurate and my own inferences sound, The two had fought for a love on whose account either might have cast away honor, power, even life like a worn-out shoe. It was a wretched story. I do not know what course the triangle took, but Professor Kasagami emerged victorious in love, while Professor Kinuma suffered a crushing defeat and ultimately remained a bachelor for life. Although I too had attended high school, I was born and raised in Tokyo and did not meet the two professors until I entered the Imperial University. That was when I first heard the gossip. During the 3 years since, however, I had studied closely under both men and become especially intimate with Professor Kasagami, visiting his family home. I therefore had ample reason to believe that the story was not mere rumor, but very nearly the truth. Yet I had never heard it directly from either professor or from Mrs. Kasagami, and I possessed no evidence. For that reason, I told the chief that I knew nothing. The chief studied my face for a while, but did not pursue the matter. Instead, he abruptly shifted the direction of his questions.
I understand you often visit Professor Kasagami's house.
Yes. So it had come at last. This was the question I had secretly dreaded. I did indeed visit Professor Kasagami frequently. By then I revered him not merely as my teacher, but as a loving father. Considered calmly, I had no cause for fear. Even if there had been a romantic triangle involving Professors Kasagami and Kinuma, it had occurred more than 20 years earlier. Whatever feelings they might have held then, the two men had since occupied lecture halls at the same university and passed the years without incident. Both were now over 50. Nothing could possibly arise between them after all that time. Thus, however strangely Professor Kinuma might have died in a room of his own house, it seemed impossible that Professor Kasagami could be connected with it. And yet, when the chief pointedly questioned me about Professor Kinuma's lifelong bachelorhood and my intimacy with Professor Kasagami, I felt an indefinable dread, though it was probably only foolish anxiety. After all, I had escorted Professor Kinuma into his bedroom and was most likely the last person to see him alive. If the police joined that fact to my close relationship with Professor Kasagami and began to regard me suspiciously, the consequences might be dangerous. Nothing in this world is more frightening or more difficult to dispel than a misunderstanding. Though I knew it was unnecessary, I could not keep myself from adding, almost defensively, I intend to go into forensic medicine, which is why I have been especially close to Professor Kasagami. The chief did not appear to attach as much importance to my relationship with Professor Kasagami as I had feared. He nodded lightly.
I hear Professor Kasagami is a rather unusual man.
Yes, somewhat.
And that his wife is exceptionally beautiful.
Yes, though she is already over 40.
But doesn't she look considerably younger than her age?
Yes. Some people take her for little more than 30.
I hear Professor Kasagami pays no attention whatever to his home.
Yes. I had no choice but to agree. The professor was so absorbed in his scholarship that his beautiful wife seemed not even to enter his thoughts. Whatever might have been true in the past, one could scarcely believe now that these two had ever been passionately in love.
They say Professor Kasagami has nothing in his life but scholarship, that scholarship is his mistress.
Yes.
And aren't there all sorts of rumors about his wife?
There is nothing of the kind. I answered with some irritation. In spite of the cold treatment she received from the professor, Mrs. Kasagami had served him with complete fidelity. She was a woman beyond reproach. The chief gave me another probing look.
Is that so? A husband immerses himself in his work and neglects his home. Naturally his wife does as she pleases. Such things happen often enough.
I know nothing about other households, but Mrs. Kasagami would never do such a thing.
Still, a handsome young fellow like you visits her house.
What an insult. My lips trembled violently. What are you suggesting? I visit Professor Kasagami's home often because I admire and revere him. What exactly are you trying to investigate? Perhaps my vehemence surprised him, for the chief abruptly dropped his smirking expression.
There's no need to become so worked up. I am investigating whether such a thing has or has not occurred.
That depends on what you mean. Why is there any need to investigate such a thing in the first place?
Whether there is a need is not for you to decide.
The chief bristled for a moment, then immediately returned to his former tone.
We shall end that subject. I hear you are interested in forensic medicine. Would you examine this for me?
He opened a desk drawer and took out what appeared to be a scrap of paper. Blood type research. I must digress briefly here to explain the curious chain of circumstances that bound me to Professor Kasagami. As I have said, both Professors Kasagami and Kinuma had attended M High School before me. During my own time there, of course, I often heard the sort of proud stories told at every school about distinguished former pupils. In our case, that no fewer than 2 eminent professors in the medical faculty were our alumni. I did not come to know either man personally, however, until I entered the university. Once I began attending their lectures, I reacted as nearly everyone did. I immediately liked Professor Kinuma and, if anything, disliked Professor Kasagami. Kinuma was cheerful and open-hearted, while Kasagami was pale and gloomy. Everyone favored the former and kept a certain distance from the latter. It was remarkable enough that 2 men from the same district should have shared the same classes from middle school through university, followed the same profession, and after graduation stood shoulder to shoulder as professors at the same institution. More remarkable still was that their personalities should have been complete opposites. Outwardly, Professor Kinuma was bold and expansive. He drank heavily and, perhaps because he was unmarried, frequented cafes and dance halls. He was an animated conversationalist and highly sociable. Everyone was dazzled at first and soon came to admire him. Closer observation, however, revealed an inward timidity, a decidedly spiteful streak, and a good deal of cunning. He was perpetually anxious about his reputation and would not shrink, when necessary, from subtle and contemptible methods to preserve it. I know of 2 or 3 associate professors with exceptional learning and surgical skill who were deftly removed from his path under the honorable guise of promotion to professorships at provincial universities. I also know that he had pupils conduct research and then proudly presented it to the academic world as his own. His eloquence enabled him to disguise the emptiness of his lectures and, whatever his standing among fellow scholars, easily to present himself to the public as a learned and devoted man. Every student was dazzled on first hearing his dashing lectures, and most remained under his spell to the end. Professor Kasagami, by contrast, appeared somber, curt, and inarticulate. He did not drink, and his awkward formality made him difficult for anyone to approach. Yet close observation showed him to be inwardly kind, compassionate, utterly free of malice or guile, faithful to scholarship, fair, and selfless. He had few pupils, but cherished them deeply and surrendered credit for his own achievements without hesitation. Professor Kinuma treated people well when they served his interests and cast them aside when they did not. A man in his favor yesterday might be condemned today. Professor Kasagami, on the other hand, would help even someone who spoke ill of him, so long as that person showed scholarly promise. The more one knew him, and the closer one became, the more his virtues revealed themselves. I do not believe, as Professor A of N University does, that a person's character is determined by blood type. Nevertheless, it is interesting that Professors Kinuma and Kasagami had entirely different types. Kinuma was type B and Kasagami type A. That difference would later become a crucial element in a painful tragedy and form the very core of this story. It cannot be lightly passed over. Human blood types have by now become almost common knowledge, so there is no need for an elaborate explanation. Yet the subject will later bear directly upon this story, and the question of blood type also played an important part in bringing Professor Kasagami and me together. I shall therefore touch upon it briefly. I have already mentioned that Professor Kasagami specialized in forensic medicine. He had studied blood types more deeply than anyone and was the foremost authority in the field. The classification of human blood into 4 types, A, B, O, and AB, according to the properties of its blood cells and serum, was by then established beyond dispute. Since the classification itself could be performed with relative ease, forensic medicine was concerned above all with its applications. The most important of these was the determination of parentage by blood type. Filial duty and loyalty, benevolence and justice, propriety, wisdom, and good faith. All the foundations of human morality begin with parent and child. It is regrettable but true that, even in this highly advanced age, science possesses no certain method of proving parentage. Blood type research can, however, establish non-parentage to a considerable degree. If neither parent carries type A can never appear in the child. If neither carries type B can never appear. If the father is type A, the mother type O, and the child type B or AB, then either the father, the mother, or both must be excluded. When the mother is known with certainty, the father must naturally be someone else. If the same type A father and type O mother have a type A or type O child, neither parent is excluded, but neither can the relationship be positively proved. A type O mother may bear any number of type A or type O children by another type A man. When type AB enters the question, 2 theories divide scholarly opinion. Under the theory of 2 pairs of co-equal traits, there are 4 hereditary factors, and if either parent is type AB, children of any of the 4 types may be born. Under the alternative theory of 3 hereditary factors, a union between type O and type AB produces children of type A or B. Unions between A and AB, B and AB, or 2 AB parents produce A, B, or AB children, but never type O. In short, a type AB parent can never produce a type O child, and a type O parent can never have a type AB child. After long controversy, experiments may be said to have established the latter theory as correct. Professor Kasagami was an ardent supporter of the 3-factor theory and had devoted almost painfully strenuous effort to it. After entering medical school, I gradually became interested in forensic medicine, especially blood types and their applications, and so was naturally drawn toward Professor Kasagami. But, as I have said, he was unsociable, stiff, and not easily approached. Some of my friends mocked my intention of entering forensic medicine.
There's no point in studying under Kasagami.
One of them even said. As I approached him little by little, however, I came to see sincerity behind his gloom, tenderness beneath his rigidity, and impartial selflessness behind his brusque manner. My respect and affection steadily deepened. Then, about a year ago, an incident occurred after which the professor said to me,
"Would you care to visit me at home?"
I was told that, in more than 20 years of teaching, he had never extended such an invitation to any student. From that point, our friendship developed rapidly. My interest in blood types naturally led me to test my own and discover that I was type A. I then decided to test my parents and siblings to contribute to the statistical record and asked the professor to guide me. By then, he regarded me as a serious research student and had shown me considerable kindness. He readily taught me the method of determining blood type and gave me the necessary sera. I immediately tested my father, mother, younger brothers, and younger sisters, with an unexpected result. My father was type B, my mother type O, and all my younger siblings type O. I alone was type A. Yet according to established blood type theory, a type A child could never be born to type B and type O parents. At the same time, I had no reason whatever to doubt my parents. I reported the result to the professor. Could it be an exception? I asked. He looked steadily into my face.
"You are certain there was no error in the testing?"
It was his constant warning that determining blood type only appeared extraordinarily easy. A layman might be shown once and seem able to perform the test immediately thereafter, and might indeed produce a result. But the procedure must never be taken lightly. Without sufficient experience and meticulous preparation, one might mistake agglutination caused by another factor for the relevant reaction. He therefore insisted that tests performed by the inexperienced carried a real danger of error. I'm quite sure, I answered. The professor thought for a while.
Try it once more.
That was his instruction. I performed the tests again, but obtained exactly the same result. The professor said,
It is not that I doubt your ability, but would you take samples and bring them to me?
My parents and younger siblings protested at being put through it yet again, but I took a small amount of blood from each and brought the samples to the professor. 2 or 3 days later, without saying a word about the results, he asked,
Were you born in your present house?
That was his question. No, we moved there only 5 or 6 years ago. I was born in a hospital, I believe.
In a hospital?
Yes, I was my mother's first child, and to be safe, she gave birth at K Hospital in Yatsuya.
In a hospital?
The professor repeated the words in apparent surprise, but immediately resumed his customary composure.
Ah, I see.
He said nothing further. About a week later, the professor suddenly asked,
Would you care to visit me at home?
That was how his invitation came. Naturally, I was delighted to accept his kindness. From then on, I visited his house frequently. Whenever I called, the professor took me straight to his study, offered all manner of useful observations, showed me unusual foreign books, and asked about my family. He exerted himself so earnestly to entertain me that one could plainly sense how great an effort it cost this habitually silent and unsociable man. Through it, I came for the first time to understand the kindness and tenderness that filled his inner nature. I often met the professor's wife as well. As I have said, she was beautiful enough to look 10 years younger than her true age. Her face was white and lustrous with scarcely a trace of powder, and her unadorned clothes gave her an air of immaculate simplicity. The only surprise was the curiously formal and distant manner between husband and wife. Though the professor made a deliberate effort to discuss many things with me, he scarcely addressed his wife except when necessary, and even his occasional remarks to her were invariably no more than a few words. I had heard that their marriage followed an intense courtship, and the coldness between them baffled me. On reflection, however, such formality might simply have arisen from the professor's character. He was wholly absorbed in scholarship, with no other tastes or interests. His manner did not necessarily mean that his feelings were cold. His wife remained gentle and faithful to the utmost. She never opposed his wishes, never asserted herself, and behaved so discreetly that even her footsteps made no sound when she entered or left the study. Toward me too she showed restrained but ample kindness. Their marriage was certainly not the completely separate arrangement some people imagined, in which the professor lived his life and his wife hers. Rumor said that their outwardly cold relationship had begun about 10 years earlier, after their only child, a boy in his early teens, died. Another story held that it had begun soon after the marriage. I did not know which account was correct or whether both were false. This has been a long digression, but it should explain how my study of blood types brought me into such close intimacy with the professor. Let us return to the main account. The threatening letter. The chief took the scrap of paper from his desk drawer and showed it to me. It was a rectangle cut from thin drawing paper, somewhat larger than a postcard. Written on it in rounded script, a style used by draftsmen, were the following words and symbols. Erinern C. sich Zwanzig Jarver. Varum. O times A gives B. It is German, I said. It says, remember 22 years ago. Then there is Warum. Why? But as for these symbols. I cocked my head. People are apt to solve everything by applying the branch of knowledge they know best. It is said, for example, that when a patient complains of severe abdominal pain, a surgeon immediately thinks of appendicitis, while a physician immediately thinks of gallstones. Accordingly, my first thought was that these symbols represented blood types, and in this I was not mistaken. Well, could this be referring to blood types?
What do you mean?
It is asking why. Why does O times A produce B?
What does that mean?
Why should two parents of types O and A have a type B child? That must be the question.
And how does it relate to the preceding sentence?
I don't know. The chief nodded as though there was nothing to be done. I asked, "What is this, anyway?"
It was found in Professor Kanuma's bedroom.
Really? The fact surprised me, but no further thought came. More important, I suddenly realized that I had endured a lengthy interrogation without being told the one essential matter. I could wait no longer. How did Professor Kanuma die?
Gas poisoning. Somehow the heater pipe came loose. The room was full of gas, and he was not discovered until about 8 this morning.
An accident? Caused by the professor?
That would seem so. The bedroom door was locked from the inside.
Then perhaps he kicked the pipe loose. It was certainly connected when I left.
Yes. We know for certain that the professor got up at least once to lock the door.
How did no one notice until 8?
It was a holiday. And after the late night, they must all have been sleeping soundly.
The explanation was entirely possible. One or two prominent men had in fact died from gas leaking from heaters. Nevertheless, something about Professor Kanuma's death struck me as unreasonable. Then it has been ruled an accident.
Yes.
The chief looked me over sharply.
That is our conclusion in general. Still, he was a man of some prominence, so we must be thorough. That is why we troubled you to come here. Since you have made the journey, would you accompany me to the scene? There are matters there I wish to ask you about, and as you know something of forensic medicine, you may be able to offer useful advice.
I doubt I can offer any advice, but I shall be glad to accompany you. We immediately drove to Professor Kanumiya's house. It was already a little after 10. Pale sunlight filtered through a mostly overcast sky, but the air remained bitterly cold, and water sprinkled on the streets was still frozen hard. A uniformed policeman standing guard before the house had his shoulders hunched against the cold. At the sight of the chief, he straightened abruptly and saluted with great respect. The bedroom had been preserved untouched, with the body still in place. The professor, so vigorous the night before, was now utterly bloodless. His eyes half open and his mouth twisted, he lay dead and rigid, his upper body exposed above the quilt. Something struck me as strange. Judging by the state of rigor, he appeared to have been dead for at least 10 hours. That placed his death no later than midnight, only an hour and a half after we had left the room. Even if the professor had risen immediately after our departure, locked the door, and accidentally disconnected the heater pipe at that moment, the gas could have leaked for only an hour and a half before he died. Could a healthy man really be killed outright by a leak of merely 90 minutes? I surveyed the room. It covered roughly 20 square meters and had a fairly high ceiling. The windows now stood wide open, but even when they were fully shut, 2 wire-meshed ventilation openings remained in the corners near the ceiling. I did not know precisely how poisonous the gas was. If it had poured from the pipe into this room for an hour and a half, a man might conceivably lose consciousness, be left near death, or fall into a death-like state. But could he actually die within that time? Seeing me peer about the room, the chief immediately asked,
"Is anything different from last night?"
"No." That was my answer, but his question reminded me of the journal that had interested me the night before. I looked at the desk. Although I had certainly left the journals neatly arranged, they now seemed somewhat disordered. Perhaps the professor had handled them during the night. With that thought, I stepped closer, picked up the journal on top, and turned a few pages. I almost cried out. I managed to restrain myself and stole a glance at the chief. Fortunately, he was crouching on the floor, busily examining something, and appeared not to have noticed. What had startled me so? When I escorted Professor Kinema home the night before, my attention had been caught by a journal on his desk because it was one that I, or rather Professor Kasagami, had long been searching for. It was a German medical journal published 1 or 2 years earlier, containing a photographic plate of an unusual hang body that would serve as a valuable reference in forensic medicine. Very few copies had reached Japan, and even in Germany the print run had been small, making the issue impossible to obtain. When I happened to find it the previous night, I had felt a flash of righteous anger at Professor Kinumiya's spitefulness. He must have known that Professor Kasagami wanted it, and since it lay outside his own specialty and could mean little to him, he might easily have presented it to Kasagami. Instead, he possessed it and kept silent. Now, when I opened the journal, what did I find? The photographic plate alone had been torn out. It had plainly been done in great haste. The page was ripped so violently that one corner of the photograph remained behind. Had Professor Kinuma torn it out? Had the professor, lying half asleep on the bed, noticed my interest in the journal and risen the moment I left to tear out the plate in haste? He was capable of such behavior. But why was there any need to act so quickly? Did he fear that I might return to the room and take it? If so, he could have prevented that without tearing out the plate alone. Surely he did not imagine I would creep back in the middle of the night to steal it. The whole matter was incomprehensible. I wanted, if I could, to search the desk drawers and elsewhere for the missing plate, but naturally I had no such freedom. I quietly returned the journal to its place. The chief was still crouched on the floor, occupied with something. I approached silently and looked over his shoulder. He was repeatedly rubbing the thick carpet. In a circular patch about an inch across, the heavy pile had completely changed color. When rubbed by hand, it crumbled as though scorched, though one could tell at a glance that it was not an ordinary burn. Perhaps because I had come beside him, the chief muttered something under his breath and stood abruptly. He went to the washstand in the corner to clean his hands and turned the tap, but no water came out. He clicked his tongue.
TCH. Is it broken?
The elderly housekeeper, standing outside the door, apparently heard him.
It must have frozen in this morning's cold.
That was her explanation. The chief did not reply. Abandoning the attempt to wash his hands, he returned to the center of the room. At that moment a detective hurried in, clutching something like a Western-style envelope, evidently having made a discovery.
Chief, this was in a drawer of the study desk.
The chief took the envelope-like object and withdrew a square piece of paper.
German again?
He turned to me.
Read this one too, please.
It was made of precisely the same paper and cut to the same size as the sheet I had seen earlier. The writing was again in rounded script. As I read, the color drained from my face. Written there in German were these words. Remember April 24th, 1922. And that was the date of my birth.
What is it? What's wrong?
Seeing my extraordinary reaction, the chief barked the question almost as an interrogation. It says, remember April 24th, 1922. That is the day I was born.
Whom?
The chief stared at me suspiciously.
Is nothing else written there?
No. When I was shown the similar sheet at the station, I had not understood it at all. Now the truth was clear. Someone had sent these threatening letters to Professor Kinuma. The first sheet simply told him to remember 22 years ago. The later one gave the precise date, and that date was my birthday. What did the apparent blood type formula added to the first sheet mean? If it was intended to point to me, it should have read, O times B gives A. For I was type A, born to a type O mother and a type B father. I no longer knew what to think. One fact alone was certain. I was being drawn into the vortex of Professor Kinumiya's mysterious death. 3 questions. It was nearly noon before I was finally allowed to go home. Clutching my throbbing head, I left Professor Kinumiya's residence and was immediately surrounded by newspaper reporters who had been lying in wait.
Who are you? Did Professor Kinuma kill himself? Was the professor involved with a woman?
Licking their pencils, they each showered me with whatever impertinent questions occurred to them. I barely broke through and returned to my lodgings, only to find reporters waiting there as well. Journalists from one paper after another visited in succession. By the end, I wanted to cry aloud. At about 2, I was finally released, but had no strength left to think. I spread out my bedding at once and crawled beneath the covers. My mind was exhausted, yet sleep would not come, nor could I form a single coherent thought. Every eerie and terrifying thing I had ever experienced or read about rose in succession before my mind. I would begin to doze, then awaken with a start. In this condition, I reached the evening. At dusk, I got up, went outside, and returned with every evening paper I could find. Anyone who has ever been even slightly involved in an event knows the intense desire to read its newspaper account. In this case, I seemed, though I did not yet understand how, to be deeply involved in a grave affair. I devoured the reports. It was deeply ironic that, despite my actual involvement, despite being summoned to the station, interrogated, and even shown the scene, I knew almost nothing of the details and had to learn them from the newspapers. Yet that was precisely the situation, and nothing could be done about it. The reports differed little from one another. Combining the facts scattered among them, I formed the following account of Professor Kinumiya's mysterious death. At 8 that morning, Professor Kinumiya was found cold and dead on the bed in his bedroom. The room was filled with gas. The corrugated hose connected to the heater had come free from the gas pipe, from which gas was still pouring violently. The body had been dead for 7 or 8 hours, bore no external injuries, and had plainly succumbed to gas poisoning. The previous evening, the professor had attended a gathering of medical students from M High School. He became heavily intoxicated, was escorted home by one of the students, and went to bed at about 10:30. There were unmistakable signs that, after lying down, he had risen once to lock the door from the inside. It was therefore believed that, while doing so, he accidentally caught his foot on the gas hose, pulled it loose, failed to notice, and returned to sleep, causing the tragedy. On the other hand, the professor had recently received what appeared to be threatening letters and seemed to feel unsafe. He had begun carrying an automatic pistol for protection. Questions also arose because, even in his drunken state, he remembered to lock the door. It seemed strange that a man with enough presence of mind to do that could kick the heater pipe loose without noticing the escaping gas. The authorities were therefore said to be conducting a more exhaustive inquiry. The police physician's examination at the scene had made death by gas poisoning clear. For the reasons just stated, however, the body was to be sent to the university for autopsy. Professor Kasagami, the authority on forensic medicine, was expected to conduct it, but an unspecified circumstance had caused Associate Professor Miyahuchi to take his place. The papers suggested that even the authorities retained a trace of doubt about the cause of Professor Kinumiya's death. According to the police physician, the body had been dead for 7 or 8 hours. Since that estimate was made at about 8 in the morning, the professor must indeed have died around midnight, within 2 hours of my departure. Could less than 2 hours of gas leaking from that heater really have killed him? The newspapers did not mention the point, but to me it was the first great question. Second, there was the missing photographic plate, a fact known to no one but me. If Professor Kinumiya had not risen and torn it out after I left, someone else must have entered. But by what means? Since the door was locked from the inside, the visitor must have obtained the professor's permission to enter. Or had someone slipped quietly into the room before the professor locked it, torn out the plate, and departed unseen, after which the professor happened to awaken and rose to lock the door. Even then, who could possibly want a gruesome photograph of a hanged body, valuable only for scientific study? Perhaps Professor Kinumiya himself had torn it out after all. Whatever the answer, the whereabouts of the plate were plainly important. Third came the bizarre, threatening letters. One bore my date of birth. Was that merely coincidence? It fitted too perfectly for chance, but even supposing it was chance, what did it mean? The more I thought, the less I understood. An idea occurred to me. I pulled an inorganic chemistry textbook from the back of my bookcase and looked up carbon monoxide. The gas used as fuel was a mixture of coal gas and water gas containing approximately, the percentage is omitted in the source, % carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is violently poisonous. When people speak of poisoning by fuel gas, it is this substance that kills them. The textbook's entry on carbon monoxide read as follows. It is a colorless, odorless gas of extreme toxicity. When present at 1 part in 100,000 parts of air, it already produces symptoms of poisoning in anyone breathing it. At 1 part in 800, death occurs in about 30 minutes. At 1%, in barely 2 minutes. Once absorbed, carbon monoxide combines with the hemoglobin in the blood and deprives it of its function, the transport of oxygen. I took out pencil and paper and made a rough calculation. Professor Kinuma's bedroom was about 12 tatami mats in area. Taking its dimensions as 12 feet by 18 and the ceiling height as 10 feet, the room contained roughly 2,200 cubic feet. I did not know the heater's precise gas output, but from my experience a device of that size could emit no more than 5 liters per minute. That made 300 liters, or about 10 cubic feet, per hour. Even if Professor Kinuma died at 1 in the morning, the gas could have escaped for at most 2.5 hours, producing 25 cubic feet. If the fuel gas contained 8% carbon monoxide, then in 2,200 cubic feet of air the concentration would be less than 0.1%. Since that was the maximum concentration reached only after 2.5 hours, I believed one could say with certainty that death had not yet been possible. Of course, the exact time of death remained unknown, and it might be premature to conclude anything before the autopsy. Nevertheless, the figures made the professor's death exceedingly strange. Yet I had no idea what other cause could have killed him. If a body without injury had plainly died of carbon monoxide poisoning, what conclusion was possible except poisoning by the fuel gas? My head began to split again. I threw down pencil and paper and rolled onto the tatami. The torn photographic plate. The next day I felt vaguely ashamed to go to school. I had nothing whatever on my conscience, of course, yet the thought of having people look at me was unpleasant. Everyone was eagerly discussing Professor Kinumiya's death, and quite a few asked me impertinent questions, though none was as bad as the reporters. Professor Kasagami lectured that day. He began by expressing grief over Professor Kinumiya's untimely death, then was about to proceed with the lecture, as usual, when one student asked,
Professor, did Professor Kinuma die of gas poisoning?
That was the question. Professor Kasagami gave the student a sharp look.
I believe he probably did. In fact, I was ordered to conduct the autopsy in order to confirm the cause of death. For reasons of my own I declined, and asked Mr. Miyahuchi to perform it instead. I spoke with him briefly just now, and he says there can be no doubt that it was carbon monoxide poisoning.
The professor's manner was always solemn, and that day it was graver than ever. Even the class wit could not venture another irreverent question and fell silent. I considered asking about the time of death, but decided I could do so at any time outside the lecture and kept my mouth closed. The professor began his lecture. Perhaps it was only my imagination, but he seemed less energetic than usual. I privately concluded that the accidental death of a colleague had distressed him. After class, I went to the professor's department. What a terrible thing to have happened to Professor Kinuma.
Yes, it was terrible. And it caused you considerable trouble.
That doesn't matter. Professor, I believe Professor Kinuma died around midnight. What do you think?
Mr. Miyahuchi estimates the time between 11 and 1.
11? That would be less than 30 minutes after I left.
An estimate of time of death cannot identify a single precise point, so ordinarily one allows a considerable interval. It was probably nearer 1.
Even if it was 1, only 2.5 hours passed after I last saw the professor. Could the quantity of gas released during that interval have caused fatal poisoning?
Yes, it could.
He paused and reflected.
At the very least, it could have produced a state of apparent death.
then actual death would have occurred later?
That would follow.
Then the time of death. The professor lightly interrupted me before I could finish.
That is a difficult question, especially in a case of gas poisoning.
I see. The answer struck me as slightly strange, but it came from the foremost authority on forensic medicine, and I had to accept it.
Leaving that aside,
The professor said, gazing steadily at me with a significant look.
there is something I wish to discuss. Would you come to my house today?
Yes, I shall be glad to. I could not imagine what he wished to say, but agreed at once. At that time, visiting the professor and listening to him discuss various subjects was one of my greatest pleasures. That evening's papers devoted only a few lines to Professor Kinuma. The autopsy had established death by carbon monoxide poisoning, and in view of the surrounding circumstances, the authorities had ruled it accidental. That night, I visited Professor Kasagami. He welcomed me warmly and, as usual, spoke at length on useful scholarly matters. Yet he never touched upon the something he had so significantly mentioned at noon. Perhaps I merely imagined it, but several times he seemed about to broach a subject, only to reconsider and return to academic discussion. In the end, he said nothing. Looking back, I believe he had intended to tell me something far more important. Unable to bring himself to begin, he would sigh quietly and continue with some other scholarly topic. If only I had noticed sooner, I might have questioned him directly and heard the whole story. My dullness prevented me from forestalling the tragedies that followed, and I can never cease regretting it. Professor Kinuma's funeral was conducted on a magnificent scale under Professor Kasagami as chairman of the funeral committee. Kinuma had been extremely sociable and possessed friends in every sphere of public life. More than 2,000 mourners attended, including several hundred prominent figures. But the spectacle was like a sparkler. Once it burned out, the home of this man without wife or child became literally as desolate as a house whose fire had gone dark. Precisely because his social life had been so brilliant, he had almost no friends willing to mourn him quietly afterward. By the end of 1 week, then too, most people had forgotten Professor Kinuma. The university, the students, his friends, and the public at large forgot that he had ever existed. If anyone mentioned him, the reply would surely have been, "Professor Kinuma? Ah, yes, there was such a man." If anyone still remembered his death, it was probably I alone. The 3 questions I secretly carried did not readily fade with time. Above all, the words of the threatening letters grew more vivid in my mind with every passing day. Remembered 22 years ago, then my date of birth. I could not believe that they were wholly unrelated to me. Had I not encountered what happened next, even I would probably have forgotten Professor Kinuma in the end, without consciously meaning to, just like everyone else. Fate did not permit it. I was destined to suffer still more. It was, I think, about half a month after Professor Kinuma's death when I paid my customary visit to Professor Kasagami's house. As I have said, our intimacy increased at an accelerating rate with every meeting. Indeed, it was the professor who actively drew closer. The better I knew him, naturally, the more I recognized his compassion, his uncompromising honesty, and his many other virtues, and the deeper my reverence grew. But before long his manner became less that of a teacher than of a blood relative. He went so far as to humble himself in his efforts to please me, as though the very idea of my leaving him would be a catastrophe, and the intention was unmistakable. Since Professor Kinuma's death, this behavior had intensified until it resembled a lover's devotion. Inwardly, I found it almost eerie. That day, after our customary wide-ranging conversation, I was invited to dinner, at which his wife joined us. This too was remarkable. The professor, once so distant toward the woman that society had begun to gossip, had lately changed his manner, gradually becoming exceptionally gentle and attentive to her. After Professor Kinuma's death, the transformation grew abrupt. Though never demonstrative in words, he became more devoted to his wife than most ordinary husbands. She was pleased, yet the very violence of the change seemed to fill her with some apprehension. Previously, they had never shared the table, but now the three of us dined together pleasantly. Afterward, Mrs. Kasagami withdrew to the kitchen to clear away, and the professor briefly left the room. Idly, I picked up one of his books from the desk and riffled through it. Something slipped from between the pages and fell onto the tatami. I hurriedly picked it up. It was the very photographic plate from the journal the professor had so desperately wanted. Wondering when he had obtained it, I examined it closely, and the color left my face. One corner was missing, and the edge was extremely jagged. It had plainly not been cut with scissors, but torn by hand. I distinctly recognized the shape of that missing corner. It must still be attached to the journal in Professor Kinomiya's room. If this plate were placed against the fragment remaining there, the two would undoubtedly fit together with perfect precision. The discovery was so unexpected that I stood staring blankly at the photograph. I did not notice the professor return and stand motionless behind me. When I happened to turn, he was standing there, pale-faced. He gave a start.
"Ah, I forgot to tell you. I found that photograph."
He spoke casually and returned to his seat, but I did not miss the strange hoarseness in his voice. I too replied as though nothing were amiss. "Did you?" I searched for it as hard as I could, but never managed to find it.
A second-hand bookseller I deal with located it. Someone else wanted the remaining articles, and as I required only the photographic plate, I let him keep the rest.
I knew plainly that the professor was lying. Had a bookseller brought the journal and removed the plate, he would never have torn it out so violently. If the professor meant to lie, he should have said from the beginning that the bookseller brought him the loose plate alone. Habitually honest, he could not invent a convincing falsehood on the spur of the moment. The professor continued his explanation.
"Since I had asked you to search for it, I should have told you when it was found. It simply slipped my mind. I am sorry."
Not at all. I replaced the plate between the pages, returned the book to the desk, and immediately changed the subject. The professor appeared relieved and did not mention the photograph again. I could not keep my spirits from darkening. Concealing it from the professor as best I could, I soon made my excuses and prepared to leave. Who stole it? The discovery of the photographic plate placed a crushing weight upon my mind. There was no room to doubt that the plate in Professor Kasagami's possession had been removed from the journal in Professor Kinomiya's bedroom. The journal was exceedingly rare. Despite every effort, neither Professor Kasagami nor I had been able to obtain it. Had Kasagami's plate been cleanly cut out, there would have been no problem. But one corner was missing, and the signs of violent tearing were unmistakable. Conceivably, another copy of the journal might have existed, and someone might have torn out its plate so roughly that an identical corner remained attached, but that was impossible. The journal itself was extremely scarce, the plate very valuable, and under ordinary circumstances no one would remove it in such a brutal manner. Even had the page torn accidentally, the person would have cut out the fragment separately and mounted it on the back to restore the plate. If the plate unquestionably came from the journal in Professor Kinomiya's bedroom, who had taken it? Had an unrelated third person removed it, and it later reached Professor Kasagami, the professor would have had no need to lie about the route by which he obtained it. On the very day it arrived, he would probably have smiled at me and said, "At last I have that photograph." Since he concealed his possession of it and lied when I happened to discover it, only two explanations remained for the means by which he had acquired it. First, the professor himself had obtained the plate dishonestly. Second, a third party had obtained it dishonestly, and the professor, fully aware of the circumstances, had bought it from that person. Under either explanation, someone must have slipped into Professor Kinomiya's room and stolen the plate on the night of the gas poisoning, after I had left. If a third party did it, two further possibilities arose. First, the person had entered to steal it at Professor Kasagami's request. Second, the person had entered for another purpose, happened to find the plate, then disclosed the circumstances and sold it to Kasagami. I wished to reject the first possibility. Professor Kasagami had known nothing of the desired journal's presence in Professor Kinumua's house. Had he known, I believed he would have told me. Even if he had known, he would simply have asked Kinuma for it if he wanted it. I had heard of no such request. And even if Professor Kinuma refused, Professor Kasagami was absolutely incapable of hiring someone to steal it. Valuable as the plate was, it was not worth such a risk. As for the second possibility, it was doubtful that Professor Kasagami would knowingly purchase an object obtained under such dishonest circumstances. As I have just said, it was not valuable enough. Had he bought it without knowing its history, then the moment I found it he would naturally have said, "So-and-so brought that to me," or, "I bought it from such and such a person." Considered in this way, neither possibility could have occurred. Returning to the earlier alternatives, the idea that a third party obtained the plate and handed it to the professor could not stand. I was forced to conclude that Professor Kasagami had obtained it directly himself. I reconstructed his movements that night. Professor Kasagami had left the gathering shortly before Professor Kinuma. Whether he went straight home was the question. Suppose Professor Kasagami had some purpose in mind, left first, and reached Professor Kinumua's house before us. Kinuma arrived hopelessly drunk and collapsed in the entrance, while the elderly housekeeper, the maid, and I made an uproar carrying him to the bedroom. The front entrance stood wide open. Someone could have slipped inside and hidden in another room without great difficulty. After I left, while the housekeeper and maid put away Professor Kinumua's discarded clothing and chattered together, Professor Kasagami could have slipped quietly into the bedroom, torn the plate from the journal, and crept out of both room and house without either woman noticing. Professor Kinuma might then have awakened, locked the door, and returned to bed. Every part of that sequence was entirely possible. But here I must repeat the same point. Even if Professor Kasagami had slipped into Kinumua's bedroom, it plainly could not have been for the sake of that single photographic plate. Kasagami appeared not to have known it was there, and even if he did, it was not worth such a risk. Then what had Professor Kasagami intended? An involuntary chill passed through me. I knew of no reason why he should have had to kill Professor Kinuma. Yet if he truly had slipped into the bedroom, could that midnight venture have been undertaken to murder him? He could have crept into the bedroom, disconnected the gas hose, and escaped. It was possible. But how then could one explain the door locked from within? If Professor Kinuma awakened and locked it, could he have failed to notice the hissing gas and its peculiar odor? A man clear-headed enough to lock a door could hardly fail to notice a violent leak. Yet the same difficulty applied to the official theory that, while rising to lock the door, he kicked the hose loose and returned to sleep without noticing the gas. At the height of extreme drunkenness, the numbing of the senses can make a person insensible to minor stimuli. One might just conceive that Professor Kinuma stumbled into the bedroom alone, struck the heater, disconnected its rubber hose, failed to notice, and crawled straight into bed. But after a period of sleep, even one as short as 30 minutes or an hour, the numbed senses recover considerably. Indeed, it may be more accurate to say that their recovery causes the sleeper to awaken. If Professor Kinuma lay down, slept for a while, and then woke, he would have sobered enough not to kick the gas pipe or overlook a leak. Moreover, he had not been so completely intoxicated. He had sufficient will to undress and put on his nightclothes, and he distinctly told me to go home. He was not unconscious. Had he been that drunk, he would surely have slept soundly until morning and never awakened. The very fact that he rose no later than 1 o'clock to lock his bedroom door showed that his intoxication had been relatively shallow. No matter how long I thought, I could not resolve it. Like a repeating decimal, my reasoning ultimately returned to its starting point. How I wished I could forget the whole question at once. Eureka! But I could not forget. That accursed photograph. I wished I had never seen it. Of course, I had no intention of acting against Professor Kasagami. On the contrary, I looked to him as both teacher and parent, respected him from my heart, and loved him deeply. Had anyone accused him, I would have defended him at any cost. Under some circumstances, I might even have sacrificed my life. Yet I could do nothing about the faint suspicion I myself harbored toward him. I could only lament how obstinate and inescapable suspicion can be. Even if Professor Kasagami truly had entered Kinemua's bedroom, even if I learned that he had gone there with some dreadful purpose, the thought of denouncing him never entered my mind. Were he ever placed in such danger, I wished that I might take his place. Yet suspicion remained suspicion and would not disappear. I wanted to know. Somehow I had to learn Professor Kasagami's secret, why he had entered Professor Kinemua's bedroom, and what lay behind those bizarre, threatening letters. By then I no longer doubted that Professor Kasagami had sent the letters to Professor Kinuma. They were written in German. They included a formula apparently referring to blood types, and Professor Kasagami possessed the plate missing from Professor Kinemua's bedroom. No one else could have been the sender. There must have been a secret between the two professors. Perhaps it arose from the romantic triangle involving Mrs. Kasagami. More than 20 years had passed, and outwardly the affair had long been settled. Something, however, must have remained. What a dreadful suspicion. I struggled desperately to forget it, but the effort only made it more consuming. Sleeping or waking, I thought of nothing else. I even feared that I would make myself ill. Unless I could solve this terrible doubt by my own efforts, I would remain so agitated that I could do nothing at all. The very thought of prying into the secrets of the professor I revered was repugnant, but I could not refrain. Terrified that he might notice, I put seemingly casual questions to him and drew his wife into various conversations. I also sounded out people who might know something of his past. I learned almost nothing. I also struggled to uncover the secret of the night Professor Kinuma died. The fundamental mystery was that the bedroom door had been locked from within. I could not be satisfied with newspaper reports alone. I repeatedly visited the elderly housekeeper at Professor Kinumiya's residence and verified the facts. She testified firmly that the door had unquestionably been locked from the inside. Every window was fastened from within as well. The key, she said, remained properly inserted in the lock. I recalled tricks from detective fiction. Foreign mystery writers had racked their brains to devise 2 or 3 ways of locking an inside key from outside. Those devices were already far removed from practical reality. When I asked the housekeeper for more details of the door, I remembered none of them could possibly apply. It was an undeniable fact that Professor Kinuma had died in a sealed room. The police were entirely justified in declaring the death an accident caused by leaking gas. Yet how had the hose come loose? Why had Professor Kinuma failed to notice? And how had that hateful photographic plate come into Professor Kasagami's hands? Had matters continued in that state, I might have had no course left but madness or suicide. Fortunately, a chance discovery spared me that fate. It occurred about 5 days after I found the plate, roughly 20 days after the death. I returned to my lodgings with my feet badly soiled and, unusually, entered by way of the kitchen. There my eye fell upon the gas measuring device commonly called the meter. It was a box-shaped dry meter painted red and fitted with a large main valve. If that valve was closed, the gas stopped in every room. Since our lodging house used no gas heaters, the landlady strictly instructed the maid to shut the valve every night at bedtime. With it closed, no accidental leak could occur, and everyone could sleep safely. If a gas heater burned through the night, however, the meter valve could not be shut. If it were, the flame would go out. At that thought, I leaped into the air. I had heard the story of Archimedes, ordered to determine whether a golden crown was genuine. At his wit's end, he entered a bath, saw the water spill over, and, struck by inspiration, shouted, "Eureka! Eureka!" before springing out. At that moment I experienced precisely such a eureka. If one turned the meter valve while the heater was burning, the flame would go out. Turn it back again, and gas would pour freely into the room. It was exceedingly simple. Professor Kasagami, or not necessarily Kasagami, but some person, slipped into the house while the housekeeper, maid, and I were in Professor Kinemua's bedroom and waited with bated breath. Once we had withdrawn, the intruder first closed the main valve at the kitchen gas meter. Then he entered the bedroom and disconnected the heater hose. Naturally, No gas escaped while the main valve was closed. For some reason, Professor Kinuma awakened, rose, and locked the door. The heater flame was out, but no gas was leaking, so he noticed nothing and lay down again. Once the professor had fallen back asleep, the intruder reopened the kitchen valve. Gas would then pour into the bedroom. 2 points in this explanation remained imperfect. How could the intruder foresee that the professor would rise and lock the door, and how could he know it had been done? Further, why did the professor fail to notice the leak that began after he returned to bed? There remained the earlier and greater question of how he died within less than 2 hours. Linking that fact to the latter difficulty suggested that Professor Kinuma must have died soon after lying down a second time, and that the meter valve was opened afterward. However loudly the gas hissed, a dead man could not notice it. How, then, had the professor died? The answer was simple. Authorities had conclusively established that carbon monoxide poisoning caused his death. He therefore unquestionably died of carbon monoxide. But at the time of death, the gas leak probably had not yet begun. Even if it had, the total quantity released contained far less carbon monoxide than a fatal dose. It followed with the certainty of subtracting 1 from 2 that carbon monoxide had been introduced by some other means. Professor Kinuma had been killed by sending carbon monoxide into the sealed room. The disconnected heater hose and escaping fuel gas were a trick designed to create the false impression that the carbon monoxide in the fuel had killed him. But how had the violently poisonous carbon monoxide been introduced into the room? Here I made another important discovery. A fact that had barely brushed my thoughts at the scene suddenly flashed back into consciousness at precisely the right moment. Producing carbon monoxide is not especially difficult, but it requires apparatus, a dangerous chemical such as sulfuric acid, and heat. Generating it after slipping into another person's house would not be easy. Even if the equipment and chemicals could be carried inside, conveying the gas into a sealed room would be difficult. To make a small quantity effective, it would have to be delivered near the victim, preferably near his nose, which would require feeding a rubber tube from outside. Even from the attic, the fine wire mesh over the ventilation opening left no room to lower such a tube. And since carbon monoxide is somewhat lighter than air, introducing it from above would reduce its effect. If the gas were compressed in a pressurized iron cylinder, commonly called a gas bottle or bomb, its pressure could force it into the room from outside. Even then, the purpose could not be accomplished without inserting a tube into the room. Moreover, such vessels are made of thick iron and are extremely heavy. A single person could scarcely carry one while slipping into another's house. The remaining possibility was liquefied gas. It could be carried with great ease in a Dewar flask, commonly known as a vacuum bottle. Poured through the ceiling vent, it would fall toward the floor or vaporize before reaching it, and accomplish the purpose perfectly well. Carbon monoxide can be liquefied only at extremely low temperatures. Its critical temperature is minus 139 degrees Celsius, and its boiling point minus 190. So unlike carbon dioxide, it is not ordinarily encountered as a liquid. Carbon dioxide, the gas commonly called carbonic acid gas, can be liquefied readily. Its critical temperature is 31 degrees, and its sublimation point minus 79. In household carbonated water devices known as siphons, it is used as a liquid inside cylinders smaller than a thumb. Carbon monoxide, too, however, can be liquefied. If 1% in air kills within 2 minutes, the pure gas must kill almost instantly. What first directed my attention to liquefied carbon monoxide was something the police chief and I observed when we visited the scene. Near the bed, the carpet had a ragged hole about 1 inch in diameter. At first glance it resembled a scorch, but it was not one. Anyone who has seen an experiment with liquid air knows that its extreme cold rapidly draws heat from anything it touches. On skin it produces an injury like a burn. A rubber ball becomes as hard as pottery and shatters when struck. Liquefied carbon monoxide is scarcely less cold than liquid air. If spilled on a carpet, it would inevitably make the fibers brittle and ragged. I had not noticed it then, but the damaged patch lay near the head of the bed, not directly beneath the ceiling vent in the corner, but very close to it. There was one further point. The water at the washstand had been frozen that day. Because the morning had been extraordinarily cold for Tokyo, the housekeeper attributed the freezing to the weather, and everyone accepted her explanation. On reflection, however, it was already 10 o'clock and the temperature had risen considerably. It was strange that the water should still be frozen. The washstand lay beyond the head of the bed, with the vent between them. It was therefore reasonable to suppose that, as the extraordinarily cold liquefied gas vaporized, it drew heat rapidly from the surrounding area and froze the water. Since the chilling in this case affected a broad area, the exchange of latent heat might well have prevented a rapid return to normal. Imperfect though the explanation may be, I believe it shows how the crime was committed. But who was the criminal? What was the motive? What did the threatening letters mean? And what happened between the intruder's entry into the bedroom and the victim's rising of his own accord to lock the door? I knew none of these things. My solution covered only one small portion. Questions followed upon questions without end. I was still condemned to suffer. Professor Kasagami's Last Testament. For another week after making the discovery I have described, I continued to suffer. Then I was suddenly confronted by a horror beyond all comparison. Professor Kasagami and his wife had killed themselves. When I heard the news, I fell for a time into a state almost like unconsciousness. Professor Kasagami left 2 notes, one for public release and another addressed to me. The public notes stated that, for reasons of their own, he and his wife were taking their lives together, that they left their entire estate to me, and that in return they entrusted every matter concerning the funeral and their affairs after death to my care. The letter addressed to me was under no circumstances to be published for 1 year. As I said at the beginning of this account, on reading it I immediately wanted to follow the professor and his wife and take my own life. I barely restrained myself and spent a painful year praying for the repose of their souls. Now I am about to make the letter public. What effect will it have upon society? I shall probably be surrounded by newspaper reporters again. And what will my parents think? That prospect terrifies me. I shall conclude this account by presenting the professor's letter below, and then I intend quietly to depart for somewhere without telling anyone. But I shall remain faithful to his instruction and will never take my own life.
To Mr. Kenichi Uzawa, Shuzwa Kasagami. Although our acquaintance was brief, the happiness of knowing you with true affection was immeasurable. For this alone I give profound thanks to God. I shall now depart for the next world together with my wife, for the reasons I am about to explain. You will surely grieve, how terribly you will grieve. That is what I fear most. But you are a young man with a promising future. You must recognize the grave responsibilities you bear toward your parents, toward my wife and me, toward the nation, and toward society. An accursed fate compels us to hasten to our deaths, but we go with one consolation and one hope, that you will remain alive in this world. I beg you earnestly, never entertain a rash thought. This is the wish of us both. Please keep this one request inviolate. If you become an honorable man and honor our memory after we are gone, it will surpass tens of thousands of sacred sutras recited by holy monks. Now, where am I to begin? I believe you know in broad outline the strange bond between Professor Kainuma and me. We were born very near one another and followed precisely the same road through university graduation and appointment as professors. Our rivalry in every sphere ultimately caused the ruin of us both. Yet it was a fate laid upon us, and regret is useless now. After leaving the university, we were forced to compete desperately for the love of a woman who stood between us. You know, I think, that the woman became my wife. As you know, Professor Kainuma was exceptionally cheerful, sociable, and eloquent. In every respect I was his opposite. You can imagine the disadvantage under which I contested that love. For a time my wife too was completely dazzled by him. In her unmarried youth she associated freely with Professor Kainuma as an intimate friend. Trembling with envy and jealousy, I could do nothing but watch. Gradually, However, she began to understand that he was not the man his outward appearance suggested. He was calculating, contemptible, and profoundly selfish. At last she tried to withdraw from him. Then one day she narrowly escaped a grave violation at his hands. Having barely escaped, she never approached him again, and soon afterward we were married. Outwardly, Professor Kainuma rejoiced in our marriage. He gave us a present and delivered congratulations at the reception. We did not then realize that he was such a terrible villain, and believed he no longer harbored resentment toward us. We were far too trusting. Behind our backs his eyes blazed with obsessive hatred as he waited for an opportunity for revenge. Never dreaming of this, we were very happy. My wife soon became pregnant, and before a year of marriage had passed we were the parents of a lovely boy. Our misfortune came less than 3 years later. As you know, it was around then that I began my blood type research. Just as you later did, I tested myself, my wife, and our child. I was type A and my wife type O, but the child was type B. No matter how many times I repeated the tests, the result remained the same. Science held that type A and type O parents could never produce a type B child. If there were an exception, every study of blood types would become worthless and the entire field would have to begin again. Yet my wife was more faithful than the most faithful of wives, and there was not the slightest reason to suspect her. Science, however, would not permit a type B child born to me as father and her as mother. Alas, I was a scientist. I could not overturn science's verdict with the mere appearance of my wife's fidelity. Blood type research might admittedly be incomplete and not absolutely certain, but if that were so, neither could my wife's fidelity be absolute. It was self-evident that her unmarried years, or times when I was absent or away from home, could not command a certainty greater than that of science. I was tormented. Should I believe science, or believe my wife? I grew more despondent by the day, and, taciturn to begin with, became more silent still. There was only one thing for me to do: pursue blood type research further. If I could overturn the accepted theory, my wife's fidelity would thereby be proved indirectly. If the theory stood, she would bear the brand of adultery. Her close association with Professor Kainuma before marriage, the violation she narrowly escaped, the pregnancy that came so quickly, and, Professor Kainuma's blood type was B. Try as I might, I could not prevent myself from growing more distant toward my wife each day. Like a maddened horse, I plunged blindly into research. Naturally, I never said a word to her about the blood types. I believe she attributed my remoteness to my natural character and devotion to my work. In answer to my coldness, she served me with ever greater fidelity. Until her virtue could be proved, I would not even allow us to conceive another child. For better or worse, the child we had was 11 when he died. Only now do I shed torrents of tears for that unfortunate boy. Poor child, who died alone without ever tasting a father's love. How pitiable he truly was. My research advanced, but it produced only further grounds for denying my wife's fidelity. For 20 long years we were husband and wife, yet not husband and wife. She endured her husband's cold gaze and suspicion while remaining faithful to the end. What a pitiable woman she was. And yet, what a pitiable husband was I. We might have had to live for another 10 or 20 years in that state. But heaven did not remain forever merciless. I cannot believe that your joining my circle as a student was mere chance. Had it been chance, you would never have tried to approach me, any more than the other students did. Nor would you have thought of beginning blood type research or testing yourself, your parents, and your younger siblings. It was all the will of heaven, never coincidence. I shall never forget my first shock, hearing that your tests showed your father to be type B, your mother type O, and you yourself type A. To make certain, I repeated the tests personally. The results were exactly as you reported. An even greater shock came when I learned that you had been born in the maternity ward of K Hospital. And when I investigated your date of birth, how I kept my sanity at that moment I shall never understand. By now you must realize the truth. My dead child was also born in the maternity ward of K Hospital. His date of birth was precisely the same as yours. You and the boy who died were born in the same place on the same day. Newborn infants possess no striking distinguishing feature apart from sex. In a hospital maternity ward, a child may conceivably be exchanged for another through an attendant's carelessness or mistaken assumption. Hospitals therefore sew identifying marks into the infant's clothes or attach numbers. In the maternity hospitals of large American cities, newborn fingerprints are difficult to take, so footprints are recorded to prevent such mistakes. K Hospital too could hardly exchange infants indiscriminately. I do not believe negligence or accident was involved. But no procedure can prevent a deliberate exchange. The man who intentionally exchanged our child was, of course, Professor Kainuma. What a merciless and cruel revenge. After hearing of your blood type, your birth at K Hospital, and your date of birth, I investigated with all the thoroughness in my power. The result proved that it was indeed Professor Kainuma's hateful plot. At K Hospital the maternity ward stood directly opposite the orthopedic operating room. At that time Professor Kainuma had a friend on the orthopedic staff, and I discovered that, having successfully gained his cooperation, Kainuma was constantly entering and leaving the orthopedic department on the night before my wife gave birth. Moreover, if you and my dead child were restored to your proper places, the blood types would no longer conflict in any way with the conclusions of science. Of all possible instruments of revenge, what a depraved violation of human bonds he chose. What suffering it inflicted upon my wife and me. Under other circumstances we might have continued in that torment until death. What could repay him for it except death? Yet it would be meaningless simply to kill him. He had to understand fully what deed was bringing death upon him. I sent him documents that forced him to remember the birth of our child and bore symbols suggesting blood types. They unquestionably struck their target. He grew terribly agitated, began carrying a pistol for protection, and took to locking his room. Without a word, he confessed his inhuman act. That night I hid inside his house. As you left, I slipped into his room and made a certain alteration to the gas heater. My eye then happened to fall upon the journal on his desk, and I rashly tore out the photographic plate. That act later caused you to suspect me. After arranging the trick at the heater, I calmly shook Kainuma awake. He started and made a frantic grab for his pistol, but I caught his hand, accused him of his old scheme, and announced that my vengeance would soon be accomplished. While he stared about in confusion, I abruptly left the room. Just as I expected, he did not shout to summon the household. He immediately rose and locked the door from within. That was precisely what I wanted. I waited until he lay down again, then by a certain means introduced the poisonous gas and released fuel gas from the heater. I do not wish to set down the details of the murder. You may infer them. My trick succeeded. Not one person but you questioned the cause of death. It was ruled an accidental fatality from gas poisoning. At first I intended to repay Professor Kainuma's silent and contemptible torment with an equally silent vengeance, then pretend to know nothing. My conscience would not allow it. I was also terribly frightened that you appeared to have noticed the truth. I resolved after all to take my own life. When my ill-fated wife heard everything, she said she wished to die with me. In the end, I consented. While we lived, my wife and I longed to tell you just once that you were our true child. Several times we almost did so, but could never utter the words. I had been far too cold toward the child whom circumstance made mine, and then lost him. To claim you now as my son would be an unforgivable wrong to your parents. Believing you their true child, they raised you with love. In my eyes you resemble neither them nor your younger brothers and sisters very closely, yet they nurtured you without the faintest doubt. How different that was from my ceaseless suspicion and torment. After treating the dead boy so heartlessly, I cannot face your parents. Nor have I the courage to insist that you are our child. And so, farewell. Never forget the request with which I began. Become an honorable and upright man, and live happily.
The Japanese Mystery Library. Classic mysteries from Japan in English. Subscribe to hear the next story.